Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this, our latest 5 in 25 webinar. And today we're looking at the award stage of a procurement, which is often one of the most interesting parts of the procurement and where many legal challenges arise. So a really good topic for us to think about today. Introductions, I'm Jenny Beresford-Jones and I'm a professional support lawyer and public procurement specialist in the procurement team here at Mills & Reeve. And I'm here today with my colleagues Claire Gamage and Kim Fraser, both of whom are also procurement specialists, and we obviously work very closely together on all things procurement. Claire's got her camera off for the moment, as you might see, but she's having a little bit of difficulty with her internet, but she may be able to turn it on a little bit later, so we'll see. Just before we get started on the award stage and the tricky questions that we're going to try and answer today, just to sort of signpost to you all, I think everybody must be aware by now of the procurement bill, which is making its way through Parliament. It's now reached the committee stage in the Lords. I think it started the committee stage on Monday of this week. And that's the stage at which they go through the bill, suggesting and agreeing amendments to it. So I think we will expect to see a second draft of the procurement bill sometime after the summer holidays, once the MPs have had a chance to go through it all. So really just to let you know that you can keep an eye on our procurementportal.com/reform page, where we're going to put all our stuff that we've produced in relation to public procurement reform, and particularly just to signpost you towards our client briefing, which is our kind of A to Z of the main changes that the bill is bringing. We also have a recorded vlog with some of the sort of highlights of those changes, and also a procurement phrase book, which will sort of help you to identify some of the new terms in the procurement bill and how they link through to what we currently know in the public contracts regulations. So do have a look at that, and obviously when we get a new draft of the bill, we will be updating all those materials as well. In terms of today's session, just a few points of housekeeping. So we've got the Q&A box open. If you've got any tricky questions or legal questions that come up, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, because we're really trying to stick to our 25-minute format. We won't be answering questions live in the session, but we'll do what we usually do, which is to create a Q&A document in which we'll do our best to deal with the questions that have been asked, and that will be circulated to everybody afterwards, together with a recording of the session. So this session is being recorded, but rest assured that nobody can be seen apart from the panel members, so don't feel that you need to hide your cup of tea or anything like that. Finally, at the end of the webinar, you should see a short feedback form pop up, and as ever, that would be really great if you could just take a minute or two to fill that in, because it really will inform how we design our sessions going forward. And I think probably that's all we needed to say on housekeeping. I can see Claire's managed to put her camera on. So let's hand over to Claire, who's going to talk to us about setting award criteria that are effective as well as being lawful. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Jenny. Hopefully my Wi-Fi will hold up. Apologies if I suddenly dip out. So starting with the question about what are lawful criteria, just a reminder slide there that at the invitation to tender stage, we're now moving to looking forward. So we're no longer looking backwards as we do at the selection stage, which is all about evaluating the bidder itself rather than the bid. So at this stage of the process, the award stage, our evaluation criteria and our focus has to be on what is the bidder offering for this contract. So we're evaluating the bid itself and not the bidder anymore at this point. Just move to the next slide, please, Jenny. In terms of what the rules are under the procurement rules under law, there are two places we can find more detail about what constitutes lawful award criteria. And firstly, you've got the black letter text of the public contracts regulations themselves, and you will find at Regulation 67 certain provisions which talk about what constitutes lawful award criteria. I won't go through all of these in detail, and I will keep to my 5 minutes, but as you can see on the slide there, some of the key principles are that obviously your award criteria have to be linked to the subject matter of the contract, so they have to be relevant to the contract that we're letting. You can structure your award criteria on the basis of price or cost, which can include life cycle costing. And what the regulations say is that you can set a price quality ratio, which essentially is up to the authority to determine what's more important. Is it price or is it quality, and set that ratio accordingly. The aim of the award criteria is to identify the most economically advantageous tender, or the MEAT. So you might hear us refer to the MEAT occasionally, and that's what we mean, basically the highest scoring bidder, the most economically advantageous tender. So just moving on to the next slide, please, Jenny. Case law also obviously forms part of procurement law. So what the law says about what a lawful award criteria should look like. And there's quite a lot of case law in this area, and I'll try not to step on Kim's toes, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of these cases later on. But hopefully this is quite a useful reference point. So if you do find yourself regularly drafting award criteria, these cases are really helpful. They set out some key lessons which have been learned by other authorities who have got stung by drafting award criteria in a certain way. Just touching on one of those, MLS Overseas and Secretary of State for Defence. This is how intricate the process is. Basically, the Ministry of Defence hadn't defined what a fail meant within their award criteria. They hadn't defined that. It actually led to exclusion. So you need to be very, very clear about the consequences of pass-fail scores, and also how you're going to score the bid generally. And again, it might be useful to look at that case law if you find yourself drafting award criteria on a regular basis. Just moving to the next slide. So that's what the law says about award criteria. But what about the practical side of things? What are our top tips for setting effective award criteria? And some of the things I've put on the slide there are from real life examples and my experiences of supporting authorities over the years. And I guess the number one would be allocate adequate time. I think it's quite an intricate process. It does take time to get the award criteria right. If you want the right result, you have to ask the right questions and you have to score them in the right way. And oftentimes this can be an afterthought. So what are the questions we're going to ask of the bidders? How are we going to score them? It's normally a part of the process which is sort of tagged on at the end and doesn't always get that time that is needed. Striking a balance between transparency and flexibility. Obviously, we have to be transparent about how we're going to score tenders, but in a lot of times, authorities don't want to give bidders the answer. So that a careful balance has to be struck between that flexibility and being ultimately objective. Consider the use of minimum scoring thresholds. They can be useful if there are certain bars of quality that the bidders have to meet to be able to be considered as a successful tenderer, but they can have the opposite effect. And I've seen many failed procurements where bidders just haven't been able to achieve that bar. Get second opinion, get someone to sense check your evaluation criteria, stress test it. Does it get spit out the right results? All of these things, if you have the time, are really, really useful and effective. So it drives through the right result at the end of your procurement process. I won't talk about multi-layered questions, as Kim will come on to that later. In terms of final tips, use a response template if you can, setting out every element of the question in a clear template so that it makes sure you get all of the elements of the question answered by the bidders. Avoid duplication. I've seen a lot of questions which essentially ask the same thing, and that can give rise to issues when demonstrating compliance with the public contracts regs if there's a dichotomy between the two scores for very similar questions. Consider whether you need to tailor scoring matrices to the question. Often I've seen the same scoring table used for every question. Sometimes that doesn't work. When you actually sense check what the question's asking, the scoring table is saying something completely different. And consider aligning the scoring criteria criteria of the contract structure. Oftentimes the procurement itself is quite a useful way of collecting information you need to populate the contract. So things like exit plans, security management plans, project plans, why not get them from the bidders as part of the process in the format that you need, so it makes that contractualization process a lot easier at the end of the process. So I'll now hand over to Kim, who's going to talk about what a good and bad score looks like. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. So for this question, we're going to think about articulating the scoring methodology. This is not the question itself or the evaluation criteria, but the scoring scheme that evaluators will apply when marking responses. For example, a score of 10 for a response that meets all the requirements of the authority, and so on down to 0 for a response that misses the point entirely. This is there is a long line of case law that confirms that this must be disclosed in the procurement documents. This satisfies the obligation of transparency and demonstrates that the authority is treating all bidders equally. The idea is that bidders are able to understand what they might write in order to score well on a question, and this also helps evaluators score responses as they have a framework to base their comments on. The scoring methodology has to be clear to the reasonably well-informed and normally diligent tenderer or rewind tenderer, as Claire's shown on her slides previously. The phrase comes from the 2001 SIAC construction case and has been applied in subsequent cases. For example, in the MLS and Ministry of Defence decision that Claire mentioned previously, where the consequence of receiving a fail for a pass-fail question wasn't clear in the procurement documents. And in this case, the court held it was not clear to the rewind tenderer and that a fail would lead to an exclusion, and therefore the contract award decision was seen as unlawful in that case. It's also worth considering the use of model answers. These are template responses that evaluators might use to help with the scoring process, but we found that model answers are seen as generally problematic. The case law confirms that information contained in a model answer should be disclosed as a matter of transparency if it's not reasonably foreseeable to a rewind tenderer. This was the case in the Mears and Leeds City Council case that was in Claire's slides. The council ultimately paid damages to the claimant for a flawed procurement process. This can be contrasted with the comments by the court in the Lancashire case, however, where although this ultimately led to setting aside of an award decision, the court did say that the evaluators' aide memoire did not amount to undisclosed scoring criteria. We usually advise that the client steer away from the use of model answers to avoid such complexities. We often see scoring methodologies that are linked to the requirement. For example, higher marks are awarded for responses that meet all of the requirement. This can be a good approach, but it only works if the requirement itself is clear to bidders. An authority may link the question to the ITT, to sections of the specification, so the required standard is clear to bidders, and it also makes easier for evaluators to score responses. I also want to touch on the multifaceted questions that Claire mentioned. Scoring questions with lots of individual requirements can be problematic as well, as it can be difficult to articulate what a good response might look like. We have seen some scoring methodologies that award marks based on how many of those requirements have been addressed. This is clear and should be easy to apply, but can be rigid in some cases. For example, what if the score awarded is awarded if all elements of the question are met, but not very well? Or what if all but one of the relatively unimportant element is scored brilliantly? It's worth thinking about how best to maintain flexibility while still adopting a transparent approach. In our experience, splitting out such questions poses the least risk. It can also be useful to remind bidders of the overall objective of the contract. These are sometimes known as critical success factors, and these might be articulated in your procurement documents and may be useful in guiding bidders on what a good response looks like. You may wish to include a specific context for each question to aid bidders, and this might be particularly useful for questions on social value, which Claire will come on to talk about next. I'll now hand you over to Claire for the next question.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm going to do a very quick whistle-stop tour of how can we best use the social value model in practice. So if we just go to the next slide, please, Jenny. Obviously, we now have PPN or Procurement Policy Note 0620, which came into force on the 1st of January last year. In scope organisations, which are defined in the PPN itself, have to give consideration to social value, and the model must apply the model only where it's relevant, proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. If we just move to the next slide, the key features of the model are that authorities have to consider the themes which have been set, of which there are 5, and I'll show you what those are in a moment. And essentially, the authority picks which of those themes are relevant to the particular contract they are letting. There is a requirement to apply a minimum weighting of 10% to social value when using the model. However, where there's sufficient justification, you can move from that 10% mandate. Just move to the next slide, please, Jenny. So as I mentioned, there's 5 key themes, as you can see on the slide there. COVID-19 recovery, as you'd expect, is quite important at the moment and quite relevant to a lot of contracts. Fighting economic inequality, climate change, equal opportunities and well-being. And then beneath each theme, you have objectives. So an authority would pick which of those objectives are relevant and important for this particular contract. What do we really want the successful bidder to deliver in terms of social value? In terms of applying the PPN, you can find all of the guidance notes and the social value model itself on the web link I've provided there on the slide for you. The last document, the quick reference table, is really helpful as it's got everything in sort of a snapshot format where you can just select quite easily which criteria you're going to use and which policy themes and objectives are relevant to your procurement. Just moving on to the next slide. In terms of how you would apply that in practice, I've put a hypothetical example up on the screen here, which hopefully articulates how you actually use the model. So if we take as an example a facilities management contract, the authority itself has decided that it wants to address social value, and it also wants the supplier to take remedial action or may wish to terminate the contract depending on the level of adherence to social value KPIs. So social value has been deemed to be very important in respect of this contract. In this case, the authority has looked at the policy themes and has selected climate change and the objective effective stewardship of the environment. So just moving to the next slide. So if you look at the quick reference table, you will see here that under the objective fighting climate change, you've got a model evaluation question, you've got model award criteria, you've got sub-criteria, and you've also got reporting metrics or KPIs that you can use to monitor performance against the social value response to which the bidder provides, a successful bidder. In practice, although a lot of the work has been done for you in the social value model, it does require a little bit of consideration. So as you can see, it does look quite complex on the face of it. So you may need to really consider how you present this in your invitation to tender. If you move to the next slide, please, Jenny, you can see there is an example scoring table provided in the PPN. So again, it does a lot of the work for you, but really consider whether these meet your definitions of what a good, poor or unacceptable response looks like. My only criticism with the example which is provided in the PPN is it talks about experience, which, as we've already mentioned, is a selection criterion. So again, you would need to fix that essentially if you were applying the model. Another thing I've seen authorities do is pad this out a little bit more. So they might have a separate document or a separate section within the ITN, or ITT, which talks about what's important to us, what do we mean, and what we are trying to achieve by setting this criterion and these KPIs. And that helps the bidders tailor their responses more towards this contract. So you get a better quality response in terms of social value. Just on the last slide there, I've let you read that in your own leisure, but I've just put some sort of what works and what doesn't work in terms of using the social value model effectively. There are some obvious ones. I'll just pull a couple out. One of the key pieces of advice I would give you is to use pre-market engagement effectively. Consult the market perhaps before you select some of these themes and objectives. Is it actually possible for the sector to deliver what you want? And pre-market engagement does save a lot of pain later down the line if you if you're getting the general sense that actually we can't deliver this, or what you're asking for is too much, or we could do this better if you look at this particular policy theme. Also, another key tip I would advocate is to, if social value is very important, that should be evident in the way that you've structured your procurement process. So consider that golden thread throughout the entirety of the process. So think about whether you need to ask selection questions. Has the bidder got previous experience of delivering social value? That might form part of who you transfer through to the shortlist, and repeat that at every single stage. So if you're doing a multi-layered procurement, like a competitive procedure with negotiation or a competitive dialogue, that needs to follow through. So ask award questions in your ITT and your invitation to submit final tenders. I've run out of time, so I will now pass to the next question. What are the different methods of evaluating price? Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, so in our experience, evaluation of price sometimes does not get quite the same amount of attention as the evaluation of the qualitative response. As Jenny will touch on shortly, the procurement regulations allow an authority to consider either the lowest price tender or the most economically advantageous tender, the latter meaning the evaluation of a combination of the quality response as well as how much it costs. The latter is more common, and the idea being that this represents the best value of money for the authority. Of course, the appropriate method of evaluating price will very much depend on the subject matter of the contract. For example, some commodity-based contracts may lend themselves to evaluating a fixed price, whereas other contracts like professional services contracts may look at hourly and day rates. The government sourcing playbook has a specific guidance on note on bid evaluation and a section dedicated to the different methods of evaluating price. The most common method of evaluating price is the relative price scoring, where the cheapest bid receives full marks allocated to the financial element of the evaluation, and all other bidders receive a score relative to that mark, depending on how they compare to that least expensive bid. This is relatively straightforward method, but it can make reverse engineering of the financial offer easy. For example, if the pricing proposal, my pricing proposal was £100, for example, and the debrief letter states that I scored 20% less than the successful bidder, I could easily work out that the cheapest price was £80, and this might lead to inadvertent disclosure of commercially sensitive information. A way around this would be to include a number of separate elements, which would make it more difficult to reverse engineer the successful offer. For more complex requirements, the alternative method is likely to be appropriate. For example, calculating a price per quality point might be an effective way of evaluating the price. This is where the authority can divide each bid price by its quality score, which is designed to enable a true comparison of what the authority will pay. With either of those methods, an authority may also consider whether it's worth disclosing an affordability envelope, which is the maximum price above which the authority will not entertain any bids. If that approach is used, the procurement document should make clear what the ceiling is, and also be clear on the bits that come in above that threshold should not be considered. Sometimes authorities like to give themselves the discretion to accept bids outside of the envelope, but this can be problematic and lead to complaints that the authority has not acted transparently. Whichever method is used, the authority will need to make clear what bidders need to submit and how this will factor into the evaluation. For example, an authority might have different elements to the pricing proposal, and the procurement documents should make clear how each of these elements will be evaluated and how this will factor into the overall score for the financial element of the response. Before the procurement document is issued, the authority should also consider whether there are any assumptions, dependencies or risks that the bidder should take into account that would impact the pricing. Assumptions can be problematic from a procurement angle because if it's left to bidders to make their own assumptions, it can be very difficult to evaluate those bidders on a level playing field. To use a very simple example, one bidder may assume a certain volume of services, which is another may take a completely different approach. To reduce the risk, authorities should limit the price assumptions and dependencies, and can even mandate allowable assumptions. The model services contract contains allowable assumptions drafting for inclusion in a contract. Finally, I wanted to touch upon abnormally low tenders. In some markets, bidders may decide to bid low for strategic reasons, and the regulations contain a mechanism to reject tenders that are abnormally low. It's an area that has been subject to much case law. Firstly, because there's no set definition of what is abnormally low. Case law has considered whether an offer appears sustainable, and the sourcing playbook suggests that bids which are more than 10% lower than the average should be scrutinised. Secondly, there is an obligation on authorities, to require an explanation where a price seems to be abnormally low. It may be that following the explanation, the authority is satisfied that the bid is sustainable, and there is a discretion to exclude a bidder at this stage. But as with every discretionary right to exclude, this comes with its challenges. It's worth checking your procurement documents to ensure that tenderers are aware of the authority's right to look closely at the financial offer, where there is a wide variance between bids, to satisfy itself that the offer is not abnormally low. I'll now hand you over to Jenny to discuss the final question.
Thank you, Kim. The final question, we thought we would just touch on where we might be going with all this in the procurement bill, because most economically advantageous tender is turning into something called most advantageous tender. That sounds like quite a dramatic change when you first hear of it. So with it, what does this mean? I think probably overall it doesn't mean quite as much as you might initially think. So sort of as Kim and Claire have touched on, at the moment, the contract is awarded to the most economically advantageous tender. And as Kim said, you can evaluate on price alone, but you can also include quality. And I think it's more usual to do that nowadays. But the overall emphasis obviously is economic. It's which tender offers the best value for money overall. So that's all set out in Regulation 6 to 7 of the Public Contracts Regs 2015. If you look at the sort of corresponding section in the procurement bill, I think that's currently section 18, there's a section there that says that the core obligation is to award the contract to the supplier that submits the most advantageous tender. And this is the tender that best satisfies the award criteria in accordance with the published assessment methodology and ratings. So you can sort of see there that it might be possible, as long as your award criteria allow for it, to sort of break the link slightly with the need for value for money considerations to be paramount, and potentially open the door to sort of those kind of social value considerations that Claire talked us through. And I was just looking at yesterday the big list of amendments that Parliament are looking at, and you can see that many of the peers in the House of Lords are wanting to sort of tie social value into procurement even more closely than the bill currently imagines, to actually make it a focus of the procurement objectives in a very sort of basic way. So it's kind of watch the space on that, really, to see how far any of those amendments make it through into the second draft. But I think the sort of caveat is why we think that the change may not be all that dramatic overall, is that the procurement we're running obviously is subject to the procurement objectives, and those are set out in section 11 of the procurement bill. And if you look at those list of objectives, value for money is one of those objectives. So you could argue that makes it a bit hard to completely ditch value for money considerations altogether. And also, although I don't think at present it's listed as a procurement objective, there are several references in the bill to the need to act proportionately when running a tender process and setting award criteria and doing all the other things that the authority does when it runs procurement. So I think those two things sort of act in a way as a slight constraint on the scope for going completely off-piste and going away from value for money altogether. And I think in practice, it's often true that the real constraints remain budgetary, and so that the price element is always going to be really significant. And it's worth keeping in mind that social value isn't something that bidders sort of offer for free or are able to offer for free indeed. If you have a significant social value element, then there will be a cost associated with that will be reflected in the price of the bid. So I suppose overall our view, subject to the fact that the procurement bill is a sort of moving picture, obviously we need to wait to see what's in the next draft, but at the moment this change from meat to mat is looking mainly like a change in terminology rather than substance. And in fact, if you look at the green paper, they've pretty much admitted that this is the case, saying that the new approach is actually already provided for in the current regulations under meat. So yeah, overall, we're not really thinking that there's sort of any dramatic change here in how we go about drafting award criteria. And I can see from my clock it's 10:30, so it's definitely time for us to let you get on with your day. Do look out for our follow-up email, so that will have the recording, a copy of the slides, and also our Q&A response document. I think I can't see the Q&A, but I can see there are 25 questions, so we'll try to address all of those that we're able to. When the webinar ends, there'll be a little feedback form that pops up, so really grateful if you could just spend a minute filling that in for us. But just many thanks to everybody for attending. We hope you found it useful, and see you at our next webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.